right, and we're on the air. Again, thank you all for attending this second presentation in the 2025 Student Scholars Series. I'm A.G. Harmon of the Columbus School of Law here at the Catholic University of America. And on behalf of the faculty, let me thank you all for zooming in to this presentation today. Please stay on mute until the presentation and response are over, and then I'll open the floor to questions, which you'll signal with the raise hand feature. The presentation today is by third-year student Mckenzie Mixon. I just want to say before she introduce her and her respondent that this series was instituted 16 years ago now in order to recognize notable legal scholarship produced by members of the student body during the previous academic year and to foster the skills associated with presenting and defending that scholarship in a professional conference-style setting. We're honored to have Mckenzie present her scholarship today. Before I introduce her, however, I'm going to introduce her respondent, Alexandra Dunn. She is a leading environmental law expert based here in Washington, D.C. She specializes in the area of agriculture, environmental justice, sustainability, species, and water quality. She's a magna cum laude graduate of our law school and a former editor-in-chief of the Law Review. She served in a variety of roles in the environmental law space, including serving as the adjunct professor for the environmental justice course here at the law school. She is currently the president and CEO of CropLife America, where she helps guide the conversation and future of sustainable plant science solutions for agriculture and pest management in the United States. Prior to her role as president and CEO, she was a partner in the Environmental Safety and Incident Response Group at the international law firm Baker Botts. Beyond these roles, Ms. Dunn has extensive government experience, which she gained while serving as the regional administrator for the EPA Region 1 in 2018, from 2018 to 2020. So we thank her for being the respondent today. I'll now introduce our student scholar. Mckenzie Mixon attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she earned a degree in public policy and had a second major in global studies and a minor in social and economic justice. Mckenzie currently serves as a note and comment editor for the Catholic University Law Review and is the co-president of the First Generation Law Student Union and the Environmental Law Society. She has previously interned for Legal Aid of North Carolina, DC Water, and the Southern Environmental Law Center, and is currently an intern with the IRS Office of Chief Counsel in the Energy Credits and Excise Tax Division. After graduation, she plans to continue a career in public interest. Mckenzie chose this topic because growing up in the South, she witnessed firsthand the environmental harm that underserved communities face and wanted to bring awareness to these issues and offer possible solutions. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Mckenzie. She is ready to lead us in this discussion, and her topic today is Tap into Clean and Safe Water, a look into the future of underinvested water infrastructure in Region 4. So I am now going to give Mckenzie the, make her the host. And Mckenzie, you are now the host, and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all see my screen?
We can.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to share it. Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for being here today. Like Professor Harmon said, my name is Mckenzie Mixon, and my topic today is Tap into Clean and Safe Water, a look into the future of underinvested water infrastructure in EPA's Region 4. So this is my abstract. This is also a photo of Region 4. It encompasses Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. I'm going to briefly read my abstract for you all. Under the Biden administration, federal funding for environmental justice communities burdened by underfunded water infrastructure became a key priority in national policy. However, accessing these resources remains a challenge in EPA's Region 4. This comment explores the historical and contextual foundations of environmental justice and water infrastructure issues in the United States. It examines how and whether funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law addresses these challenges. 2 case studies in Jackson, Mississippi and Lowndes County, Alabama are used to illustrate the real-world impact of systemic underinvestment. The comment concludes cautiously optimistic, noting that while challenges remain, new programs offer hope for meaningful reform. There we go. This is also a brief overview of the agenda that I hope to cover today. We're going to start with the history of environmental justice, then we'll move to relevant statutes and policy, followed by case studies from Jackson, Mississippi and Lowndes County, Alabama. Then I'm going to move into discussing funding opportunities from the Inflation Reduction Act and Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and other EJ policy, as well as barriers to accessing this funding and recommendations that I proposed in my comment that I wrote last year. So before I begin, though, I would like to first discuss what is environmental justice, how is it defined, and so I provided a definition that the EPA gives, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. They also provide definitions for what fair treatment means and meaningful involvement, which I think are critical to learning more about this definition, but also how it's implemented. There are a variety of different definitions out there for environmental justice, but I think what they all have in common is this goal to make sure environmental laws, regulations, and policies are applied evenly, regardless of your race, color, national origin, or income. Here's like a quick snapshot of what environmental justice, of the environmental justice history. This is not all encompassing, but these are some of like the pinnacle cases or situations that kind of led to this movement. Its origins began in the civil rights movement with this initial sanitation workers strike that happened in Memphis, Tennessee. Workers gathered together to protest their working conditions, which were abhorrent. There was a major lawsuit in the United States that was the first of its kind that charged waste facilities with environmental discrimination under the civil rights law. And most notably was the PCB landfill protest that happened in Warren County, North Carolina. There was a predominantly Black community in Warren County that protested the placement of this PCB landfill, which is a hazardous waste site in their community. This was one of the first moments in the nation's history where people finally started to realize the discrimination that Black and brown communities were facing in the United States in terms of environmental hazards. And then I've also included just 2 short studies that were done. There's a plethora of them out there that kind of solidify this idea that there is discrimination in environmental hazards, and Dr. Robert Bullard, who's coined as like the father of the environmental justice movement, he published a study titled Solid Waste Insights in the House Black Community, which found that Black neighborhoods in Houston were much more likely to be chosen as toxic waste sites as opposed to their non-Black neighborhoods, as well as another study released by the UCC, which found that while there are lots of factors that go into the placement of waste sites, race was the most significant factor out of them all. Dr. Robert Bullard also wrote a book called Dumping in Dixie, which I encourage all of you to read. It discusses environmental justice in the South in particular and the origins of this movement and what it means for the people in the South. Okay, so after this, we've gone over a brief overview of what environmental justice is and its history. Now I want to focus on the relevant statutes and policy that are kind of dictating this conversation around environmental justice and the future of environmental legislation in the South and the United States at large. First and foremost, I want to discuss the Civil Rights Act, which is what a lot of these environmental justice issues are filed under. So a lot of them are filed under Section 602 of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So what happens is they'll file an administrative complaint with the EPA under this title. Unfortunately, there are oftentimes cases where there are issues with the complaint process, and so they'll get barred from moving forward because of this, which is unfortunate. But they actually just recently released a study that under the Biden administration, if people are able to surpass this initial barrier, there was an enhanced response to claims under the Biden administration. I also think it's relevant to talk about the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act and how they work in tandem, particularly with this topic of underinvested water infrastructure that I'm discussing today. Both of these pieces of legislation are meant to regulate discharge of pollutants and water quality standards in the United States. So that means there are certain standards that are supposed to be met for these communities. But I think most importantly under them is this federal financial assistance that is provided under these acts that these communities should ideally be able to access. So there's this funding that is given under these statutes, and then communities can almost apply for them as if they're loans. And there's a really difficult process that goes into that. But unfortunately, a lot of times these environmental justice communities also typically tend to be low income. So there are issues that comes in place when it comes time to repay those loans back to the government. And then lastly, I want to talk about just environmental justice and infrastructure programs that exist within the EPA. They have multiple programs that are designed to provide assistance to communities to gain access to funding or other resources for them in order to kind of combat these environmental justice issues that are plaguing them. One that I think is one of the best programs out there is these EJ Tic Tacs. So they're actually, the entire point of them is to limit these barriers to access that communities may face in terms of getting federal funding for whatever program that they're hoping to achieve with environmental justice related, but particularly for water infrastructure development. Okay, now I'm going to move to my first case study, which is Jackson, Mississippi. I've provided a photo right here for you all to see where exactly Jackson is. If you're not familiar with the South, it sits here between Louisiana and Alabama and just a little southeast of Arkansas and under Tennessee. So what does environmental justice look like in Mississippi exactly? There's a really long, deep history with environmental justice in terms of like clean drinking water, susceptibility to hurricanes, oil spills. It's right off of the Gulf of Mexico, so that has an additional layer to it in terms of communities that may be affected by things outside of drinking water. The Mississippi government themselves loosely recognizes environmental justice and like what that means in terms of a national scale, but also for them as Mississippians. They do use the EJ screen tool, which is this really neat initiative that the EPA started, where you can use different like demographics and location type resources to kind of hone in on what communities are environmental justice communities. This would enable them to find like EJ communities within their state. So that is like the context for environmental justice history in Mississippi. It's not great, but at least there's something. So why is it that Jackson, Mississippi had this water crisis that struck in 2022? So in 2022, Jackson had a complete plant failure for their largest water treatment plant. It was overwhelmed by a flood that happened in the area, which completely prevented the plant from being able to treat the water that residents would then use in their day-to-day lives, their homes. This left 160,000 Jacksonians without safe drinking water. While unfortunately, this is not an isolated event. This was a result of years of neglect and underinvestment in their infrastructure. It ultimately led to the United States actually filing a complaint against the city of Jackson. Things are still a little wonky in Jackson, Mississippi. Like things have moved forward, but they actually instated this third-party manager to oversee the Safe Drinking Water Act in Jackson, Mississippi. Unfortunately, ultimately, what they're really struggling with is being able to access funding to secure operations, maintenance, repairs, all of these highly necessary things to ensure the future of their water infrastructure in Jackson, Mississippi, and Mississippi at large. In addition to this crisis, other crisis in the South, there's a wastewater treatment crisis that was happening in Lowndes County, Alabama. And this is Lowndes County right here. If you remember from my previous slide, it's just east of Mississippi. Okay, so like I mentioned, environmental justice in Mississippi is definitely not a priority, but it's even less of a priority in Alabama. They too have like a deep and long history with environmental justice. But there's even, like I said, a less focus on environmental justice in the state. They do have a Title VI environmental justice coordinator, but whether they're effective in their role it's hard to say. They do mostly rely on advocacy groups and nonprofits to kind of advocate for their communities in terms of environmental justice efforts. But the issue in Lowndes County, Alabama was slightly different from what happened in Jackson, Mississippi. Instead of it being a drinking water crisis, there's a wastewater treatment crisis. So what was happening in this county is typically you might have like a centralized sewer system. So when you flush your toilet, things might go to like a completely different system where the water treatment plant deals with that, the wastewater treatment plant deals with that. But instead, what was happening in these counties is a lot of people couldn't afford to have the centralized sewer system, so they would end up having pipes that would run straight into their yard, which would create raw sewage. And an investigation by the Department of Justice found that there was actually racial discrimination in how Alabama funded their wastewater infrastructure. And Alabama ended up criminally punishing and fining people for these septic systems, despite knowing that they were largely the reason behind why there was so many on-site sanitation systems instead. And so what ultimately ended up happening was in the fall of 2023, the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services actually reached an agreement with Alabama's Department of Public Health, which would provide them funding and resources to kind of move away from this on-site sanitation to more of a centralized sewer system, which if they were to no longer be a part of that agreement, or if they were to breach that agreement, the Department of Justice could actually reinstate their investigation that they originally began in regards to racial discrimination. Okay, so we've looked at environmental justice, the history of it. We've looked over the statutes that are supposed to be kind of guiding this environmental progression and protection in the United States. We've looked at these two case studies. And so what does this mean? What does this mean for the future of this region? And two pieces of legislation that I think are paramount to the future is the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The Inflation Reduction Act was a bill that was signed in 2022 by President Biden. It was kind of twofold. You have one point was to build the American economy to lower inflation, and the other one was to fight climate change and environmental injustice that's happening in the United States. And largely this was meant to be achieved through funding opportunities. So there was $3 billion that was enacted by Congress to support community efforts to confront and overcome persistent pollution and persistent pollution challenges in underserved communities. In addition to IRA is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was signed into law in 2021. This was to kind of develop infrastructure largely in the United States, but there were specific programs in place for drinking water, wastewater, water reuse, etc. And so under that bill, there was $5 billion in funding that was put in place to support this infrastructure development. And it's kind of broken down into these 7 main programs. Some of these aren't necessarily applicable to Region 4, but the ones that are, I think, are imperative that this community is able to gain access to. Okay, so those are two pieces of legislation that are paramount to these communities developing their water infrastructure, but also there's the executive component of it too, where the President Biden issued Executive Order 14004, which kind of created this Justice 40 initiative, which mandated that 40% of benefits of certain federal investments have to flow to disadvantaged communities, which is critical for environmental justice communities who are trying to gain access to funding. This prioritizes them in ways that has what's unprecedented. And this includes funding that can come from the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and in addition to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which are funds that I previously mentioned when I was discussing the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act. But not only does it provide funding opportunities, it also requires the programs to engage in stakeholder consultation and involve the local community members, which kind of speaks to that component of the definition of environmental justice, where there has to be meaningful involvement of the community members that are most affected by these injustices that are happening to them. Okay, so we have the history of environmental justice. We've looked at the relevant statutes that are meant to protect these communities. We've looked at these case studies where there's been a failure, there's been some rectification, there's this funding, but why aren't things changing like they should be? Why are there so many issues still in place in these communities? Ultimately, that comes down to access to funding. There's no federal tax that generates wealth for all American utilities. Most of it comes down to your local municipal level. And sometimes that leaves, places like in Region 4 where taxes aren't prioritized, or they're not in many states in Region 4 anyway. There tends to be lower taxes. That means there's less revenue generated for these municipal water treatment plants. But there is the funding available, right? Like I just mentioned, but getting access to this funding is the problem, whether that's limited staffing, whether the application to this funding is extensive. I mean, you have experts who are writing these applications who have been combing through these regulations and these statutes for years, trying to formulate how to get people to apply, or the best application process for people to apply. And so sometimes it can just be incredibly daunting to people to even begin to apply. I mean, sometimes these applications are pages and pages and pages and very time consuming. They can take months to apply for them. Also, there just might be lack of education for people. They might not know about the programs. They might not have the tools or resources to know how to best attack the funding, or sorry, to best attack the application to get the funding. And also there may just be wealth disparities in the area. There might be communities who are wealthier, or predominantly white communities, who may have access to resources that Black and brown communities and low income communities just may not have, because of systemic issues that are plaguing the region, or a plethora of other reasons. And also there may be discrepancies in the state and prioritization of funding. I know not every state has prioritized funding and water infrastructure as well as they should have. And sometimes that leads to discrepancies between states like Alabama and Mississippi compared to other states who may prioritize funding differently. Okay, so now that we've looked at these barriers, how do we move on from here? What's the best way to get this funding into these communities? I think first and foremost, we need to implement more programs that alleviate these barriers to access. Like I mentioned earlier, we have these TICTACs, the Environmental Justice Thriving Community Technical Assistance Center programs. Very long name for this program, but it's the shorthand is these TICTAC programs, which are aimed at eliminating these barriers to access. I think there are multiple ones based throughout the country, and even in the region. I know there's one in North Carolina with RTI, and that's where like the central hub is. And their goal is to get to these communities, get to these people, and alleviate those barriers. That way they are able to access this funding. I think there should be more programs out there focused on that, but also educating communities, because how are you supposed to get access to this funding if you're not even aware that the funding exists, or that there's this program that exists? Also, I think for those that are aware of the funding, I think it's imperative that they act quickly on the funding. A lot of it does have deadlines in place. I know there's one that the deadline is at the end of fiscal year 2026. And like I mentioned previously, it can take months to work through these applications. And so I think it's important that you get to them fast, and you get your application in quickly. I also think you need to utilize lawyers and advocates in your area who are prepared and trained to deal with changing circumstances. I mean, presently we know that there's a lot of fluctuation happening with the Environmental Protection Agency and environmental justice work in general, and lawyers and advocates, that is what they're trained to do. They're trained to handle situations that are always going to be in flux. And so I think using them and the knowledge and skills that they have in order to help get you access to this funding is critical. I know not everyone may want to move to communities who are environmental justice communities, but the work is there. It needs to be done. And I really encourage lawyers and advocates, one, to focus on doing this necessary work, but also communities to utilize the people that are willing to help them. And lastly, I think it's important that we focus on the end goal, even if results are delayed. I mean, like I've mentioned multiple times now, this is a systemic issue that runs decades deep, and that doesn't mean there's going to be a solution overnight. We're looking for a long-term solution, not something that's just going to be a quick fix. So I think just focusing on the end goal, even if it takes longer than expected, is important. People shouldn't give up. Okay. And in conclusion, I think there's a lot of funding available for underinvested water infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's limited, but there are programs in place to get people access to this funding. It is just one piece of the puzzle, though. You know, funding is important, but you also need community leaders, you need advocates, you need people fighting for this region and for people to develop their water infrastructure. I also think it's important that these federal agencies work in tandem with state and local governments to ensure that everyone has access to safe water. And even if there are changes in administrative priorities, like don't give up, keep fighting. Everyone deserves clean water, everyone deserves clean air, and everyone deserves a clean and safe life. So thank you all.
Thank you, Mckenzie. I'm going to turn things over to Alexandra Dunn now. Ms. Dunn, if you'll conduct the response for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up to questions from everyone in the audience. And Mckenzie, if you'll give me back the hosting
Absolutely.
capabilities. Ms. Dunn, go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. And Mckenzie, thank you for that terrific presentation. And thank you, Professor Harmon, Professor Sheft, and the faculty. It is wonderful to see you all. As Mckenzie noted, I am a very proud alum of the law school, and it makes me so happy to see students pursuing interest in the environment at Catholic law. It's certainly where I found my passion for the environment, and still doing it today. Mckenzie, you did a really elegant job of presenting your note and your comment, and I do have a few questions for you. First, you alluded to this. You wrote this paper during and after taking my course in environmental justice, and we were in the middle of the Biden administration, which was very focused on environmental justice and equity. And when Congress created, with the encouragement of President Biden, these very significant funding laws, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, both are affectionately known by their acronyms Bill and IRA. Sometimes people called them the uncles, because they sound like two uncles that you'd have at the Thanksgiving table, Uncle Bill and Uncle Ira. But both of them had a lot of funding for communities, and both of them in various ways prioritized communities of color, communities in need. We now have an administration that has been in place only since January 20th, and yet has made it very clear that prioritization around color, equity, or race in general is not going to be a priority of this administration. Also, the Trump administration has suggested that environmental justice is not a priority of the administration. In fact, as of today, the personnel at the US EPA who were in the environmental justice program have been put on administrative leave. And prior to joining the call, I double checked, but the EJ screening tool that you referenced has been taken down. It is no longer available. Fortunately, an ENGO was able to copy it before it was taken down, and has put it up in an independent website. And there's a lot of chatter by the communities who were using this tool, trying to fix broken links and get it back operational without the government. So dramatic change in less than a month. So I'd like to ask you, with that foundation that you referenced and now I've expanded on, what do you see as the role of attorneys working with communities like Lowndes County, like Jackson, but also the many other communities in the United States who saw such optimism and encouragement in the last administration, and maybe the opportunity to access funding and obtain help? What advice would you give the attorneys working with these communities, given the changed circumstances? And what have you learned about the legal practice through your internships and so forth that you would reflect upon in times of change?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your question. I think, and I kind of alluded to this when I was talking towards the end, like around my recommendations and my conclusion, is this has been a pervasive problem for decades. This isn't new. People have been fighting this fight for a very long time. And to many people, this change in administrative prioritization is shocking, but to some people it may not be. And so I think what the biggest piece of advice I would give a lawyers, even myself who hopes to enter this field, is you can't give up. You really can't. I mean, I think a lot of people want that. They want you to give up. They want you to roll over and just accept that this is how it's going to be. But I think as lawyers, it's our job to be zealous advocates of people, and it's our job to ensure that everyone has access to the things that they're entitled to. And in this case, that's clean water, that's clean air, that's clean and safe life. And I think the biggest piece of advice was to keep fighting and to focus on your clients and what they want. And they want this environmental justice. They want to be they want a safe and clean life ultimately. And I think that's what you have to remind yourself, that, you're here to represent them, you're here to fight for them, and you just got to keep fighting. And in terms of like my experiences and as I reflect on them, I think my this past summer at the Southern Environmental Law Center, I got to do a variety of assignments. I got to do some endangered species stuff. I got to work on like a highway project, and I think it really highlighted how things are always in flux. I mean, I went to court one day and things changed on us when we thought there's an agreement in place that ultimately changed. And I think you just have to be willing to adapt to those circumstances and keep working with what you have and continue to fight for people.
I think that's an important response, because you refer to not only the role of the lawyer as the zealous advocate for their client, but also you refer to being tenacious and being adaptive and resilient, right? Not only the communities who have been facing these challenges for a long time, but the role of the lawyer to not give up, to adapt to the new circumstances. And then I think also to be creative, right? Because while there are changes, I think the EJ screen is a great example. While the federal government may have taken it down, we saw environmental groups very quickly gather that information and put it up, and keep it alive, right? So there will be opportunities, hopefully, for these communities over the long haul. So I think that's a very insightful response. I really enjoyed your paper because you brought forward two very different water challenges. You have Jackson, Mississippi with a drinking water challenge, and then you had Lowndes County, Alabama with a sanitation or wastewater challenge. So could you highlight for the audience what aspects you thought were particularly unique in remedying each situation? Because fortunately, these two situations did get some resolution while you were studying them. So what were, maybe in each situation, something that you found particularly interesting about how each situation was resolved?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in Jackson, Mississippi's case, I think what was most interesting to resolving the issue is this third-party manager that they put in place. I thought that was a really unique way of resolving it, because that allowed this third-party person who, had no political influence in terms of Mississippi to kind of oversee things and make sure that the Safe Drinking Water Act was implemented like it should be. And I thought that was a really cool and unique way to ensure that Jackson, Mississippi's problems were getting resolved as they should. And I also thought, in terms of Lowndes County, I thought a unique remedy that they used was the involvement of the Department of Health and Human Services. Normally you think of these issues and you're just thinking of the Environmental Protection Agency, but really, I mean, environmental justice is more than just the environment. I mean, it's public health. And I thought the involvement of them was incredibly powerful way to demonstrate that, it's not just the environment. I mean, this is people's healths that are at stake, and raw sewage is not something that you need to, take lightly. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of have multi-agency involvement in an issue.
Yeah, very, very, very good insights. And I had mentioned to you that the individual assigned to Jackson, Mississippi, was a retired utility manager from Hampton Roads, Virginia, who had run a very good drinking water system in Virginia and had retired and was asked and retained to move to Jackson for a few years and oversee the significant amount of money that was being invested, and was able to ensure that there was no waste, fraud, and abuse in the funds. You can always, particularly in communities, have kickbacks, contracting, fraud, things that happen when there's a lot of money being invested very quickly. And I think that third party manager was a way to keep the expenditures above board and ensure that there was a lot of transparency in the process. So a final question for you before I turn it back to Professor Harmon would be, as you walked the halls and talked about your research with your colleagues and fellow students who are equally passionate about environmental law, what did you find amongst your classmates and colleagues in the Environmental Law Society about your work? Did any of them have any particular reactions? Was there anything about what you were studying that surprised your colleagues?
I think honestly, I don't think a lot of people were surprised that this was happening. I think a lot of people are familiar with kind of the systemic issues that are present in the South. But I think a lot of people were more surprised with Lowndes County, Alabama. I think water crises are not unfamiliar to people. I mean, we think about Flint, Michigan. I think that's a really common and pervasive topic that's discussed when you think about water crises. But I think Lowndes County, Alabama was unique amongst that. And I don't think people were as familiar or knowledgeable in the fact that there's like this sanitation issue that can also happen in terms of water infrastructure. So I think that's what shocked people the most. And also just how pervasive the discrimination was in that particular case. So I think that's what shocked people the most. But I mean, everyone was so excited to hear about what I had to say. So that was really empowering and supportive. So.
Well, it's been, I have to say, a pleasure working with you and also seeing you grow from your second year to now almost concluding your education. You have come so far and been so curious. They say curiosity is the new word for adults like me. I think we expect children to be curious, but we expect students to be curious. And I think you showed a lot of curiosity in this paper to really explore. And you started with a kernel of an idea, a passion for issues in the Southeast and states where you're from. You're not from Mississippi or Alabama, but you're from, I believe, North Carolina. And so you wanted to do work in this part of the country. And I think you were very open to kind of exploring some new places. And it was it was really rewarding for me to work with you, but also to see your innate curiosity that I know will serve you very, very well, and to see how elegantly your paper came together in the end. So congratulations, and I'll turn it back to Professor Harmon.
Thank you both, Mckenzie and Alexandra Dunn, for your presentation. It's very informative for all of us. I am a native Mississippian, so I can.
Oh, that's excellent.
My mother's from Jackson, and I spent, I can tell you how much my life has been spent in Jackson. And one of the problems that's always been there is that it does flood. I remember being there on the flood when I was like 13, and we were all looking for higher ground. My mother got us all in a car. We were at a horse show. We were looking for higher ground, which is not an easy thing to do in Jackson because there's not a lot of high ground. But the trouble was, it has historically been there too, and this is something I wanted to ask you all both about. It's one thing about access to funds, but then it's getting it done. It's actually getting it done. And Jackson, as city politics do everywhere, and Alexander, you spoke to this, and the mayor there just has been indicted, you know, in a kickback situation over the hotel, federal indictment. That there's money that has been given there, and it has just, why hasn't it been spent? Why hasn't it been done? Why don't they do anything with it? Where's the money gone? And that, I think, what is going on in the zeitgeist now is accountability for the funds. We want you to have the funds, but we want, people are like exhausted with, well, why doesn't anything ever get done? And I think I guess I could, is what part of this is, is insisting upon, okay, you should have access to this, but insisting upon that it get done, that there's oversight, that it was done, and it didn't get, clouded in some bureaucracy and lost again, and so you're asking for more money. And that's what gets people, of course, so upset about these things.
Mckenzie, do you want me to go first?
Oh, yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, well, and wonderful, Professor Harmon, to hear that you are from there. I heard the accent, but did not place it to the great state of Mississippi. And I will add a personal comment that my son, who is graduating college in May, is going to attend the University of Mississippi for graduate school. So I assume we'll be spending some time in Oxford.
Well, I went to Ole Miss, so there you go.
Yes, hotty totty. We can have our hotty toddy moment. So it is very interesting that you say this, and I will say to the point that Mckenzie made, Ted Hennepin, and I just double checked, the Jackson water system and the investment plan is being overseen by a gentleman named Ted Hennepin. And I just checked, he is expected to leave in 2027. So right now they have, and Mckenzie, if you've found that something has changed, but this looks like a pretty end of 2024 piece. So
Mckenzie has that. She has him on her presentation, I believe.
Yes, yes. And I think the fact that they brought in an independent, and you flagged this, the independent monitor, I think is incredibly important in these types of programs. Now, there was a lot of pushback on the arrival of Mr. Hennepin, because as you said, there's localism, that people are like, well, who is this outsider coming from Virginia who's going to look at our system and what does he know about us? And I think it took him quite some time to gain credibility. But I think that whether it's a third party monitor or whether it's a court oversight, I mean, sometimes we will have a court play monitor, or a court appointed monitor if it's a judicial settlement. But when I was in private law practice until recently, we often had settlements where the court would appoint a third party monitor to ensure compliance. I think you're spot on that these types of high dollar investment are subject to waste, fraud, and abuse, and we have to have a high degree of accountability. And I think that requires the public demand transparency. I mean, websites, reporting, regular, and frankly, the press. We've got to have a vigilant press. I know that there are some reporters in Jackson that are known for their digging deep and exposing. I don't think they're the most favored reporters, but they're known for digging deep. And I think that's where lawyers and other disciplines can work together to shine a bright light on what's going on.
Well, that's the thing, and maybe Mckenzie, you can speak to this, is that a new generation of lawyers coming into this, part of this is getting access to these things, but also part of it is making sure that the hard-won access is actually has results, and it doesn't get frittered away or wasted, and that's the back end of this, is somebody watchdogs this. And is that part of, I mean, is it are there watchdogs groups for this? Are there?
I'm not personally familiar with any. I think it would have to be something like the third party manager that we just talked about, somebody who's, I mean, unless there's like a local watchdog group that's taking care of this, but
there's not a national environmental watchdog or to make sure that things are insured like that. Well, I mean, I think that's something,
Yeah.
Mckenzie can start. You know,
Yeah.
All
to
right.
back end this thing and say, it's not, people don't want you wasting the money that you've got for
Yeah.
this.
I mean, I think that's a really fair concern. And I mean, to your point, like you're getting all this money, what's being done with it? How are we ensuring that now that you've gotten it, that you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing with it? I mean, I think those are real and fair
And,
concerns.
that's what sours people about things is where, you want more money, but what did you do with the last money we
Yeah.
gave you, and
Yeah.
that's what the ill will gets started over this thing. It's not always, people are justifiably, they're righteously indignant about that kind of thing. Because I want
Mm-hmm.
to not have to boil my water all the
Right.
time.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
Anybody,
And others, yeah, please. I think you're right. And it is this demand for accountability from government that I frankly look at what's happening in politics today. I served in an appointed position in the first Trump administration. I, for a variety of reasons, chose not to return to the second Trump administration. But right now, we see, for a very different reason, a very deep need for accountability around many actions being taken, and we see sort of the role that the press is playing to expose things that are happening in the government. We see the role the courts are playing, and I think when you look at Jackson, you see the same thing, right? There's courts, there's the journalists, there's the citizenry, and they're all kind of clamoring around this one
yeah,
problem.
yeah. Dean LaBelle and Dean Shept.
So thank you, Mckenzie, for your great presentation, and thank you to Professor Dunn for your response, and to, of course, Professor Harmon for organizing this. So I guess my question, Professor Dunn sort of touched on this, but I'm wondering, given the current administration and the unlikelihood that uh, be able to rely on the agencies or Congress to step in with respect to environmental justice. I'm wondering what the role of the courts and federal courts in particular should be now. I mean, everyone seems to be saying right now, the courts are our only hope with respect to many issues. And so I'm wondering, from an environmental advocacy perspective, what can we expect from our courts, or how can we rely on our court system to step in here?
Yeah, and Mckenzie, this is probably something, you probably need to have a little bit more experience out there, but feel free to chime in, because I know you've done some pretty amazing things in your time. But I will say, specific to Jackson, there is a federal court order here, and they have already been addressing that. The court order stands. There is a judge reviewing this, but already the third party manager has stated that it's unclear how the funds will be affected, the freeze in grant funding, the freeze in money. There's some uncertainty for Jackson right now. And we know that, I don't believe, if I remember my separation of powers, I don't believe that the federal judge could order Congress to appropriate funds for this project, right? That just can't happen. So there could be a gap in funding here, which will put Jackson back where we see Flint and many other communities that have a declining urban tax base, which is, for many decades, the reason that a lot of these cities systems atrophied in the first place was the historic disinvestment that Mckenzie has cited. I mean, it was related to race and choice around where we were going to spend money. That started the problem. But then there was also the fact that 90% of the funding for water and sewer came at the local level. So you have a disinvested system that's already been plagued by historic lack of investment. And then you turn to a tax base that's not there and say, please fund the system. And there's nobody there to pay for it. And there are certainly some wealthy people in Jackson, but water and sewer is billed at the same rate. We are, as a country, we don't charge people, just like cell phones or cable television. We don't charge people variable rates based on their income. So I think most Americans would find that unfair, right? I make more money, so I pay 3 times for my cell phone than someone who makes less money. We don't do that. So even in utilities, we don't say, well, we need the people in Jackson who make a higher income to pay more for water than someone who is at the poverty level. And so what happens is they keep the levels low, and you never raise the money at the local level.
So can I ask one quick just follow-up question? And then I know Dean Shept has his hand up. So so what about private entities, right? So I'm not an environmental law expert at all, but I know a little bit about what's going on with the Flint water crisis, and I believe they've been suing the engineering company and others. So is there any discussion here about like private actors involved in either of these 2 case studies who potentially could be a deeper pocket than the government to be sued?
I know, Mckenzie, in your research, did you come upon any private parties?
I didn't come across any private parties, but that's not to say that they weren't there. I think I was largely focused on like the government's role in this. But I mean, there are environmental legislations that allow for citizen suits. So I'm assuming there are definitely like private litigation that's happening or has happened.
Yeah, you certainly could have private parties that were part of the construction along the way. But like if it was a failure to construct the proper project, you could have a claim there. But unfortunately, where I thought you might be going is, are there private investors that would philanthropy that might say, hey, let's go ahead and make grants to these cities, and just like a Bill Gates Foundation that would just go in and say, let's just rebuild the Flint system, let's rebuild Lowndes County, let's rebuild Jackson. And we haven't seen that. What's interesting is we see it overseas, right? We'll see domestic philanthropy investing in infrastructure in developing countries. We all over the place, but they actually don't do it at home, which I think is very interesting.
Maybe for some of the reasons that Professor Harmon was suggesting. Might
Yeah,
be that,
maybe.
I'll turn it over to Dean Shept. Thank you.
Stuart?
Mckenzie, thanks. This was great. And Professor Dunn, it's great to see you as always. I was thinking on the private side, like if something like opportunity zones, where maybe it's not philanthropy, but it's incentives to get the private sector to invest in distressed areas. And that had like, I mean, I don't think with our current government now, it's a tough, obviously a terrible situation, but that had pretty much bipartisan support, like, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago when it first kind of was developing. And also when you talked about like who's overseeing, the work, or, maybe universities have a role. I mean, I remember I went to school for public policy, and professors were doing evaluations of programs all the time of, does this investment in pre-K education work out, 10 years down the line for these students? Maybe there's a role for state universities or to evaluate these projects or help oversee. Thanks again.
Oh, sorry, Dean Shept, to your point about the universities, I noticed that some of the Tic Tac programs are actually like housed at some universities, or they're like in like they work in tandem with them. So I actually think that's a really great proposal. If they're not already working with them, I mean, like Professor Harmon mentioned, I also have a degree in public policy, and I remember my professors doing all kinds of different work. But I mean, I think that's a really valuable, or that has a lot of value if they were to pursue that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a time to be creative. I also recall in the opportunity zone has come and gone with different administrations. I'm personally concerned that we may be going through a time where we're going to see any federal investment very tied to voter base, and where perhaps the current administration sees their core voters, which may not be urban areas. But we'll see. I mean, this election is still being studied, because there were urban areas that did change. And so it may not be urban areas tend to go Democratic and rural areas go Republican. We may find things starting to shift. The whole American political scene is in a bit of upheaval. So I think your point about the role of academia as almost a reliable, steady partner for communities is a really good one.
Well, I'm afraid we're almost out of time. If there are any other questions, anyone? If not, what we'll do is sign off. I do want to thank Alexandra Dunn for taking her time from her busy schedule to be a part of this today and give us her expertise. It was really wonderful to have an alum come back to do this in particular. And I know your time is short, but Mckenzie appreciates it, as do we all. And Mckenzie, wonderful to have you as part of the student body and so passionate about something like this. This will be recorded. There will be a story on it on the website. And we thank you all for coming today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job, Mckenzie. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.